Good afternoon and welcome to Marketing Live for Thursday, December 17th, as we close out 2015. I'm your host, Rob Zinkin, live today from the campus of Indiana University, where it is finals week. I serve as Associate Vice President for Marketing here at IU. Thank you for tuning in today as we take a look ahead to 2016. Marketing Live is part of the Higher Ed Live Network, a series of free professional development web shows and podcasts, which are always accessible to you in the archives at higheredlive.com and on iTunes. The Higher Ed Live Network offers viewers direct access to the best and brightest minds in education and beyond, and allows viewers to participate in discussions around the most important issues in the industry. Please join us today and be a part of our broadcast by sharing your insights and posing questions to today's guest using the Higher Ed Live hashtag on Twitter. Also a reminder that you can receive weekly updates with live show dates and times by subscribing to the Higher Ed Live newsletter, which will drop in your inbox on Mondays. I want to recognize our Higher Ed Live sponsors, mStoner and FormStack, for their great partnerships. Higher Ed Live is produced by mStoner, a marketing and communications firm that works with education institutions on branding, strategy, web design, and more. In higher ed, the degree is the product. Your program pages are some of the most marketing critical on your website. If you're interested in getting mStoner's model to building effective program pages and spending some quality time with one of their experts, check out the link we're about to tweet where you can learn more. FormStack is an online form builder and your go-to tool for higher ed website conversions. FormStack makes it easy for marketers to create branded, mobile-ready web forms without writing code. Build donation forms, application forms, event registrations, and more with the web's only Section 508 compliant form builder. Interact with your audience on social media using FormStack's Facebook tab or social media autofill features. For even more conversions, use FormStack's robust analytics data to refine your form. FormStack also partners with popular marketing applications so you can nurture your leads more effectively. Visit formstack.com to learn more about the ways FormStack can double your response rates and increase conversions today. Thanks again to both mStoner and FormStack. Well, it's hard to believe that 2015 is almost in the books. Higher ed marketing is a dynamic area that continues to evolve, and I'm delighted that we have Kimberly Whitler with us to discuss challenges, opportunities, and predictions for CMOs in 2016. Kim is assistant professor at the Darden School of Business at the University of Virginia. She is as plugged in as anyone is when it comes to addressing contemporary CMO challenges. It's the focus of her research, and you'll find great content from her regularly on Forbes as well as CMO.com. In fact, Kim has authored more than 100 articles related to C-level marketing issues. She also brings an extensive background in the private sector, both CPG and retail, and her previous executive marketing roles also include overseas work. Kim, welcome. It is wonderful to have you on the show.
Thanks, Rob. I'm very excited to be on the show today.
And of course, I must mention that you have 2 degrees from Indiana University, so go IU.
Go Hoosiers.
Yes. Well, to start, Kim, I'd love to give viewers an opportunity to get to know you and your story a little bit better. So I'll ask if you could share something from your professional journey, something that might not come across in your official bio that has had a lasting impact on you and your career.
Yeah, I actually love this question because it sets up why I have such an unusual career path. So after getting my undergrad degree, I got an MBA, and then I spent 20 years in the private sector in a variety of roles, finally ending up as CMO. Then in my 40s, I took 5 years to go back and get a PhD. Now, everybody asks me, why in the world would you do that? You're at the C-level, you're making a lot of money. Why would you go take 5 years to make nothing, right? To make nothing, because in a PhD program, you're a student, to be at the very bottom of the pecking order, to then enter the academic community at the bottom of the pecking order, right? And so, the answer to your question helps explain why I did all of that. In my mid-20s, I had a pastor who gave me a book called Halftime. It's written by, I think, Bob Buford. And the gist of that book suggests that as humans, we spend the first half of our year trying to accomplish success, or first half of our life trying to accomplish success, and the second half trying to be significant, to have impact. And this is oftentimes what leads to a midlife crisis, because we chase money, we chase fame, we chase fortune. And then sometime in your 40s, you wake up and you go, wait a second, that's not what life is all about. It's about having impact. And so after having read that book, I actually set out to retire at 40. And I promised myself that at 40, I'd do whatever I wanted to do, regardless of money. But what that meant is I had to save so that at 40, I could pursue whatever I thought would make me happy and fulfilled. And as it so happens, in my 30s, I started investigating what that might be at 40. And I decided to pursue a career in academia where I can conduct research, which I love, where I can really invest in helping future generations kind of achieve their dreams, which is a personal passion of mine. And frankly, where I can help CMOs solve problems that academics today aren't really addressing. So that question is interesting because it was really a book that was given to me by a pastor that kind of helped me outline the career path that I was going to pursue.
Excellent. Well, I'm sure one of our viewers will tweet out the link to that book. So thanks for the book recommendation and a great story. And I mentioned your work as a contributor to Forbes, and that has included some pieces specifically about higher ed marketing. So I'd like to begin there. And I remember at the 2014 AMA Symposium for the Marketing of Higher Education in Austin, you spoke about the challenges that higher ed CMOs face. And as marketing has become more accepted at colleges and universities and more critical for them, how have those challenges changed? Are they the same, or are there new challenges that higher ed CMOs are facing?
So just as background, to kind of put my answer in the right context, my research looks at CMO roles across all industries. So I have a really nice basis of understanding kind of the evolution of CMO roles, kind of where higher ed fits within the broader community of CMOs, et cetera. And so to answer it, I want to start by explaining something that I'm seeing in my data and research. And that is that there is this kind of natural progression of what the CMO role is from its inception. What I mean by that is the first time a company hires a CMO, okay, to the point in time at which marketers are accepted into the firm and are valued. And so let me, as you know, in higher ed, CMOs are newer to the table. They're a newer role than they are, for example, in kind of CPG retailing firms where marketing has been a very important function for decades. And so what I see in my data is that when marketing is first introduced into a company, it tends to be marginalized. Well, that makes sense because the company doesn't know what to do with marketing. All right, and I'll use one of my past experiences. I was CMO of a large home builder. They had never had a CMO, a real CMO, prior to my entering the company. So when I got there, the CEO didn't quite know what I should do. He just knew that they needed a marketer, right? And so at the very beginning, you're kind of marginalized. The role is very narrow. You tend to be kind of a communications promoter. You're not really in the strategic seat yet until over time the other functions accept you, and your boss, the CEO, the president, or the provost, or whomever, kind of knows what the potential and value you can bring to the company is. So why do I say that? If you look at law firms, the CMO role is newer. And what happens is when they first enter a company, the law firm, they tend to be marginalized because the lawyers don't know what to do with them. Same things happened in higher ed. So higher ed, because it's newer, what that means is that in many institutions, the role has been, and I hate to use this term, but it's been fairly marginalized. Okay? Now, there are things that can make that vary. If you have a very enlightened president, right? If you have a president who understands the value of marketing, then they're going to create a much bigger, more important role for marketing. Another thing that can vary is if the institution has had many CMOs and they've had success with those CMOs. So they've had experience, faculty have gotten accustomed to dealing with a CMO, then perhaps over time that role then grows from a kind of marginalized, what I'll call the promotions marketer or just the brand marketer, to somebody who can impact product design. All right, so let me give you an example of a story. There, well, at Darden, I'm going to use Darden as an example. We just brought in a dean who comes from McKinsey. All right, he understands the value of marketing given his career at McKinsey. So we're looking at different program designs, as all higher ed institutions do, but he puts the CMO of Darden onto the program design team, right? So now her role is in helping to think about program design. Now, how many schools and institutions put the CMO on a curriculum design team alongside faculty? Right, so that's what I mean. If you go to the private sector, if you're at Procter & Gamble, the marketers are leading the product development pipeline. Okay, so in higher ed, that has historically not been the case, where marketers are just communications oriented. So what does this all mean? I think a couple things. One, within higher ed, you have tremendous variance. You have some CMOs who own admissions, who are responsible for impacting the amount of donations that are generated, right? So they have kind of a P&L type role. On the other end of the spectrum, you have marketers who are in charge of collateral design, and they're a service function. And you have everything in between. What I think is going to happen, though, is that those schools that are most challenged to fill seats, and those schools that have presidents who are most enlightened and understand what marketing can do, will actually grow or build or broaden the role of the CMO. They will look to the CMO to have much bigger impact.
Yeah, and that's great context, and certainly with the rise of marketing to cabinet level roles, and it is increasing, but it's certainly not everywhere. And places where it does exist, as you mentioned, it's relatively new or can be new. So going back to your point about that strategic seat at the table, so any advice that you might give to marketers who aren't there yet, who may not have a president who is enlightened, or that marketing role may be new, and it may not necessarily be about being a direct report to the president or to the chancellor, but truly more about moving marketing to more of a strategic leadership role at their institutions?
So one of the things I've noted, by the way, the answer to this question is no different for higher ed than it would be if I were talking to folks in the private sector. Data is king. Data is your friend. And again, I'm going to give you a quick anecdote to help explain. Bill Campbell, who is the head of marketing at Chatham University, was initially, when he came in, he was one of these promotions marketers. And they, at the time, I believe, were a single gender university or college. And he went out and generated a lot of data, brought it back to the president, and suggested that they were going to hit a wall, that nobody told him to do this, right? This wasn't really part of his job design. He was there to create collateral for the university. But what he did is he went and generated data that showed that strategically they needed to shift directions. As a result of that, he ended up having responsibility for admissions. So, you know, there are many ways in which you can elevate your position. The easiest way is when a new president comes in who values marketing. And that happens all the time. And all of a sudden, then they elevate you to a cabinet position. But to have true influence or to drive the change yourself, it is through your ability to bring data and insight that helps lead the organization to understand what they should do in the future. And to be quite frank, this is an area where I think higher ed CMOs can grow in their competency, which is in understanding how to go generate primary data, whether it's about the target, a shift in target, how that should affect the design of the product, how that could affect the way in which you market the university, but how do you go get data-based insight? And I do not mean a conversation with 10 people. I mean quantitative, statistically valid, generalizable data that you can then take to the rest of the team. Remember, academics. So one of the common concerns I hear among CMOs is that they have to deal with faculty, and faculty are very difficult to deal with. Well, faculty are trained to be, they're trained to use data to assess and answer problems. So the power rests in the person who has the data. So the big piece of advice I would give higher ed CMOs is to go build your own competency in stats and how to use quantitative data to understand how to provide advice, counsel, insight, make recommendations, and to qualitative data has its place. I am a big fan of qualitative data, but it is massively insufficient in making recommendations because it is not generalizable. And so you have to really bone up on the quant side of your capability to be able to, I think, play at the strategic level of institution.
Well, when we talk about the challenges that higher ed marketers face, and many of us have heard and experienced some of those typical ones of having a myriad of constituencies to deal with, and the decentralized nature of academia. One that Jason Simon from Simpson Scarborough, who's been on the show before, has talked about is that, and it speaks to your last point and the previous point as well, about higher ed fitting in and doing so many different things. The marketing role is that he said that higher ed, we can't figure out what action we're trying to affect. And of course that impacts what we measure and the research that we do and so on. So, related to your last point, I'm curious to poke a little bit more on that in your perspective, because as you said, it could be related to admissions, it could be related to reputation, it could be fundraising and everything in between.
That's a really good point. So this is a case where, in the absence of strong presidential leadership, and to be quite blunt, I don't know that many CMOs have really great leadership and direction from the top, then the CMO must lead up. And so, the example I can, I spent a decade at Procter & Gamble in the US and overseas. And one of the best skills they taught me was how to develop a strategic plan and how to drive alignment within the organization, up, down, and sideways. That skill is critical for CMOs. So in the absence of clarity, what CMOs can do is to actually go build what they think are the right priorities and the right measures, and then they go and they drive alignment with their boss. If they have to, with the board, with their peers, they go and they help educate them on why they believe this is the right plan and this is the right assortment of measures. So part of this stems from understanding what the university's priorities are. So if the university's priority is to change the ranking, okay, then the marketer's plan should somehow link to that, and the measures should link to that. If the priority is to improve the quality of faculty, okay, if that's one of the top 3 priorities of the university, well, what is it that the marketing group can actually do to help build that? What is the right one or two measures that they can actually impact that would actually link to the university's overall strategic plan? So presidents don't know what the right measures are, and that's why it's critical for the CMO to go in and say, here are the 3 strategic priorities for the university. And so here then is how I am going to help the school achieve those. And here are my KPIs that link to the university's KPIs. And one thing I want to say, which is unique to higher ed, I don't think there's another CMO role that is so complicated in terms of the number of constituencies. As you mentioned, you have faculty, you have students, you have alumni, you have boards, you have, in some cases, the government, you have state legislatures, you have so many constituencies. It's even more important for CMOs in higher ed to have a piece of paper that clearly says, these are my priorities and here are the measures I'm trying to impact. If For example, I have a very good college president who's a friend of mine. Their critical priority is fundraising right now. They need money. So then if I'm the CMO of that school, that is my number one priority. And I would sit down with the head of advancement and try to figure out what could my team do to help him or her achieve their goals in terms of advancement. How do I partner with them? And think creatively about unique solutions I could bring to the school that could help achieve the school's goals. Then I take that strategic plan to the president, and guess what? The president will probably be pretty happy because my goals are synced up with his goals. And now that could be very different for another university, and so that's why it's so these plans are unique to the university and that year and the goals of the president and the board for that year.
And with the multitude of constituencies also relates to my next question, because I'm interested to get your perspective on differentiation in higher ed. And if we were to look at my university's competitive set, for example, there's certainly more similarities than differences among these institutions. And differentiation obviously is at the core of branding, but it's hard, particularly hard in higher education, and requires focus. But when institutions are decentralized, have so many constituencies, as you just talked about, and so many elements to their mission, how can higher ed be better about truly achieving differentiation?
So let me, if it's okay, I'm going to break that question into two parts because I want to go back, and one of them is kind of a bridge between the last question and this question. When I talked about the strategic plan, one of the things that A.G. Lafley, who was the individual who actually gave me my offer at Procter & Gamble, he ended up being CEO of P&G, and he was ruthless about strategic planning. And his primary point about planning is that what's most important is to figure out what you will not do. Will not do. What that means is you get 3 to 5 strategies, not 10, not 20, not 40. Okay, you have to prioritize things. So literally a lot of our conversations were about, I'm not going to do X this year. It's important, it'd be nice to do, but I'm not doing it because my priorities, A, B, and C, are much more important for this year. And this is a skill that very few leaders have. They want to do everything. So critically important when you have so many constituencies, a conversation around, gosh, I'd love to impact all of them. But this year, for our survival, donations are the priority. And so I am going to put on the back burner D, E, and F because I don't have the people nor the budget to do everything well. And instead, I am going to really hit hard donations this year with a secondary focus on B and C. So that's critically important to know how you can best help deliver the university's goals. And a critical part of that is what you will deprioritize. I mean, this is very difficult. By the way, when Kmart went bankrupt, there's a story that in the CEO's office were the top 100 priorities at Kmart. Is there a correlation? You know, the CEO wasn't prioritizing things. He had 100 priorities. How can any company do 100 things well? And so that's a big point. Let me then talk a little bit about your differentiation point. So I was sent by an executive recruiter a job spec. And I actually, when I do kind of small group CMO conversations with higher ed CMOs, I bring out this job spec. And on the job spec, it said that the CMO will fundamentally change the ranking of the school. This is a very large state school. Change the ranking of the school, okay? And it sounded like a tremendous job. I mean, you really felt like this person was so important. They were going to change the ranking of the school. And in small groups, I always ask CMOs, is this a good job? And invariably, they say, this is a great job. Look at how important you are. You are tasked with changing the ranking of the school. And then I ask, based on this job spec, does the CMO have responsible for the hiring of faculty, for the promotion of faculty? Do they have responsible for donations? Do they have responsibility for what students are admitted? Do they have responsibility for program design? Do they have responsibility for plant and equipment? They have responsibility for nothing that impacts the ranking of the school. The ranking is an outcome of the product, the service, the quality of the students, the amount of money that's raised. And so part of what I tell them is that you can't fully drive differentiation. You can't fully impact the brand without looking at the curriculum design. How different is the curriculum design? What's unique, novel, and special about your curriculum? What's special about your faculty? They're the deliverers of the curriculum. Do you have special faculty or not? What's special about your students? Are you able to attract the best and brightest? And without having all of those other factors that are really differentiated, you're just, all the marketer's doing is trying to put lipstick on a pig or trying to just simply package what's handed to them. And so driving differentiation, just like Tide, you can't just take any bottle of laundry detergent and somehow say, hey, there's nothing unique about this bottle, but now it's my job to go sell it as if it's very different. The product and the service and the institution needs to have something that's uniquely different so that the marketer can be actually more effective in communicating that. That's why marketers who are involved in product design, who are thinking about how do we create curriculum that serves the students, that creates a great product, which are our students, that makes recruiters happy, that makes them want to come and recruit our students, so that I can then communicate this to the broader community. Being involved in all of that is critically important. So, so differentiation is not about the communication. It's actually about, at the beginning, who are your faculty? How is the institution designed? How is the curriculum designed? Who recruits your students? What does your product look like when it goes out? It's very complicated to create a differentiated product. And this is another area where higher ed CMOs, I think, have it harder than most other CMOs. If you manage Tide, you have 5 or 6 key competitors in the US. Globally, you have 4. Okay? Higher ed institutions, how many are there? 3,000 in the US? Okay, so to differentiate among 3,000, and let's pretend that your competitive set is 20 or 30 or 40 or 50, it's a really hard thing to do. And so I think, by the way, one of the factors that that's driving the importance of marketing in higher ed is because for decades, student demand was there. It just came. And when demand is there, marketing doesn't matter. I mean, to be quite honest, you know, a rising tide lifts all boats. So in higher ed, or in home building 2005 through 2007, the whole market was growing 20–30% per year. Who cares about marketing? Well, they care about marketing when all of a sudden demand isn't there and they're competing for market share. And this is why marketers in higher ed, I think, are only going to become more important, because you have multiple constituencies, very complex. You have a lot of competitors. Now you're competing for market share. There's just not, growth just doesn't happen. You're actually having to go cultivate growth, which comes from convincing people not to go to your competitors' schools. And so this is a very hard, difficult job. But again, I would say, with the CMOs that I've talked to in higher ed, a lot of times the differentiation that they're focused on is on the back end, which is communicating the product that exists. And I think as CMOs become more strategically important in higher ed, my hope is, like Julie Dammit at UVA, that they are able to get more involved in product design and upfront design, so that when it comes time to communicating differences, they've actually designed in differences.
Well, thank you, Kim. This is fabulous insight, and I'm sure there are many marketers who wish you were sitting right across the table from their chancellor or president and with their leadership team, so that they could all hear this and understand it. And I want to inquire some more on the leadership point, because you've emphasized that a couple of times, and we know that higher ed is bringing in marketing expertise from the private sector, but as you've noted, that trend is also happening at the top. We're seeing a higher percentage of university presidents come from outside of academia. We're seeing more business schools, deans from the corporate world, just as you have experience there at Darden. So beyond what you noted with your experience at Darden, what has that impact had for the marketing role? Obviously, they understand it, and it's great if you're a marketer, but any other significant points of impact that having that outside perspective, a university president, a chancellor, a business school dean, coming from outside of higher ed, and the impact that that has on marketing?
So I would answer it by saying that it depends on the industry and their experience that they're arriving with and the individual. Okay, so if you come from CPG, if you have somebody who comes from CPG, it's more likely that they really, really value marketing. Okay, and so that means that you may have a broader role. Your expectations will be higher. You know, there's good and bad with this. They're going to expect you to have a bigger impact. They will be less likely to marginalize you, but they'll also, you know, expect you to prove and deliver. If the individual like Mitch Daniels, who came from, I believe, Eli Lilly, and then he was governor of Indiana, he has kind of an interesting background. There are a lot of people are coming in from the political space, you know, and the government has not been really super adept at using marketing, okay? It's just not a core competency of the government. So if you have people who come from the government, I'm not quite sure what their point of view might be about marketing. If they haven't been exposed to marketing, it might not be helpful. If they have, then that might be different. So my answer would be it kind of depends. It depends on the experience that the external person arrives with, and it depends on their own belief about marketing. So even, you know, individuals, for example, when I worked at the home builder, the CEO was a tremendous believer in marketing. He believed it was the future of the company. The CFO, who was from Wharton, believed that marketing was not important at all. Now, it was good that I reported to the CEO. But those are two individuals within the same company, same industry, similar backgrounds, who had very different beliefs about marketing. And so one of the things I would suggest when individuals are interviewing is to really firmly understand what the president or what your boss believes about the role of marketing. And there are many ways to ask this question. A lot of times, I've seen this a lot, presidents or CEOs will say, oh, we want marketing to transform the company. Great, can you tell me what my budget is and who reports to me? Well, you have no budget and you have nobody reporting to you. Well, then you're not serious about the CMO transforming the company, because you're not giving them the authority or the ability to effectively do that. So you have to penetrate beyond what they say to look at evidence that supports that they mean what they say. Are you on the cabinet? What's your role on the cabinet? Do you present to the board? How often do you present to the board? Right? When do you present to the board? Do you present a 5-minute little update on a couple of branding things? Or are you part of a strategic discussion about where the future of the institution is going? Getting more detailed insight into exactly how they envision that role being is going to be critical. So the person at the top is monumentally important. And while you can generalize a little bit to say that if they come from industries that have valued marketing, they're more likely to value it in higher ed, I think you would still want to penetrate it, because even then, you know, if they came from a company where they felt let down by marketing, their CMO had failed, okay, then they might bring that belief system with them to that role and marginalize the marketing role. You want to figure that out before you accept a job.
Mm-hmm. A quick reminder, if any viewers do have questions for Kim, feel free to tweet using the Higher Ed Live hashtag, and we'll certainly get those in. And you mentioned the importance of generating primary data and quantitative research. And in our last episode, the CMOs from Arizona State University and Columbia College Chicago, they both talked about how the role of marketing should really be about being the voice of the customer. And so that point of increased customer centricity, it's a new language or a new mindset for higher education. So a very broad question, but any thoughts, suggestions on how higher ed marketers can move the needle in that area?
So again, I think because marketing, the strategic role of marketing is newer to higher ed, I would actually look to the private sector because I think they're farther ahead of higher ed to try to understand how to answer that question. So for example, I do a lot of work with IBM, and I was at a CMO huddle that their first ever CMO huddle that they had last May. They're doing a lot of tremendous work on how to map the customer journey, how to get real-time data on the customer. They're doing this in the retail space. Can you apply the newest big data, the newest analytical tools? Can you apply that to a higher ed context? But here's one of the challenges within higher ed. Higher ed, the universities all tend to hire the exact same vendors who specialize in higher ed. And if, for example, if I were hired to be a CMO of a university, I would go to the best and brightest, not within higher ed. I would go look at vendors who are far beyond where the higher ed vendors are to try to go solve some of these problems. How could I track the student's journey from the first time in which they become aware of my university to the point in time at which they make decisions? How could an IBM and Adobe, some of the big companies, help me better understand, you know, where I'm losing them, why I'm getting them, why are students defecting? I talked to a university president who has a big problem with attrition after the first year. There's no reason why you can't have data on why they're leaving, and yet this university didn't have any data. You could have followed up with a survey. You could be doing surveys throughout the students' experience at the college and figuring out, gosh, in month 3, they all have a crisis of conscience for some reason. They're unhappy. Well, then what could you do in month 3 to try to improve the student's experience so that you reduce attrition, right? So part of my answer is, I think, look, CMOs today in all industries have to bone up on their skills. The pace of change is unprecedented, and it's impossible to stay on top of everything, but we have to try. So they have to, and the contemporary roles are about much more than branding. And yet many higher ed CMO roles are really centered on branding. And I think that to have a much more strategic impact, branding is strategic, but an even bigger role, they have to be adept at understanding what data exists. And I think to do that, they have to go beyond the traditional higher ed vendors to some of the best and brightest beyond higher ed. You know, what companies does a Unilever, does a PepsiCo, does a Coke use? The best companies in the world, Johnson & Johnson, what companies are they using to help provide insight? Now, I recognize they can spend a lot more than higher ed institution CMOs, but I would go look for the best and brightest. I'd attend conferences that all CMOs attend, and not just those within higher ed, because I want to learn about best-in-class practices outside of higher ed that I could bring into higher ed. Does that make sense?
It does, and I want to follow up on your point, the example of the customer journey. And again, I think it's an area where higher ed presents a set of challenges there. The customer journey is complex, it's connected, but higher education institutions are often siloed. So we have an audience that looks at the institution holistically, yet we're organized into these functional silos. So yet another point where there's some, I think, some unique challenges to the higher ed piece.
Yeah, so there's you know, the great old book by Stephen Covey, you know, Your Sphere of Influence. And so you're right, in these large institutions, the University of California system, the Indiana system, right, where you have multiple universities, multiple schools, how do you integrate all of this? I know it's a big challenge, but there's your sphere of influence. So what is within your domain of control that you can impact to help achieve the university's goals? Okay, so given your sphere of influence, what can you do to achieve those goals? The second thing then is, if you recognize that this is a problem, that this decentralization is a problem, is there a way over time, and this is a longer term goal, to help provide data-based evidence as to how it would be better for the university if, at least from a marketing standpoint, it was more centralized? Companies do this all the time. I was at that large home builder I mentioned. When I got there, marketing was decentralized. By the time I left, it had been centralized. But it took me years to provide data-based evidence as to why a centralized structure would yield better results for the regions and the divisions than each of them having their own marketing staff, right? So, but I started by saying, what's my sphere of influence? How do I affect change? And by demonstrating that I can really add value, then I earned the right to start having these discussions about centralization, decentralization.
Right, right.
And I recognize it's a big challenge for higher ed.
It is, but an exciting challenge, without question. Well, we promised some predictions for CMOs for 2016. So beyond what we've discussed, I'd love to know what are some of your most important marketing predictions for the new year, and what do we need to know beyond what we've already addressed?
So I'm going to start with something we've already talked about, and I think the best CMOs in higher ed are going to move beyond the brand. Okay, so again, in industries where marketing is new, they tend to focus on the brand and communication, the end of the pipeline. So up here, you know, we're figuring out strategy, positioning, how that affects the curriculum, the product, the service, the campus, and then all that's done. And marketers, when they enter, they're down here at the back, and they take all of this that everybody else in the university's done, and their job is to package it. I think more and more, the CMO role is going to move to the beginning of the process, and they're going to go beyond the brand to have more of a strategic impact. I'm seeing that across the board. I know the CMOs want to do this. The CMOs who are being brought in from outside of higher ed are being brought in specifically to do this. And so I think, you know, if you've grown up in higher ed, I think you're going to want to understand how to impact the university beyond the brand. I see that as a big kind of a continued movement within the space. The second thing I see, you know, content is king right now, and no place is it more important, I think, frankly, than higher ed. I just had a great conversation with Julie Dom, who is our CMO at Darden, and I really think Darden is doing a lot of terrific things. One area where they're really smart is that they've done a great job of using faculty research to strengthen the brand, to create differentiation. So there's all this content that universities have, and that's called the stuff that faculty do. Very few universities actually know how to exploit that, know how to leverage that, know how to link that to the brand to drive differentiation and to try to create more interest in students coming, faculty coming, etc. So as an example, I do a lot of work for Forbes. I write a lot for Forbes. Darden has taken my work for Forbes, my research, and they turn it into practitioner-like language. They then highlight it on the website through their ideas to action. That then helps affect a lot of things. If you're a donor, you get excited about the work that's coming out of the proprietary work that's coming out of Darden. If you're a student who's interested in a marketing career, and all of a sudden you see a faculty member who's actually doing interesting work that interests you, that might make you more likely to want to go to that school because there's a faculty member that you connect with, right? It can help drive awareness. It can bring more traffic to the website. So universities have a lot more content, but it's converting what is very boring academic prose into something that's much more interesting, palatable to all of your constituencies. Few schools are doing that well, and I think in the future, again, this is part of that differentiation question. How do you take, you know, research is unique. How do you take what is very boring and dry and convert that into usable, valuable content that can your website, drive student interest, drive donor interest, drive faculty interest? You guys have the content. It's just how do you convert that? And this isn't an easy exercise, but I do think the better schools are going to become even more adept at doing that. The third thing that I want to talk about, again, we've talked a little bit about this as well, but I think with the growing importance of marketing is this notion that there are growing expectations, right? So on the one side, hey, it's great, I'm in the cabinet meeting, I'm more important, I'm presenting to the board. On the other hand, that means you have to be even more, you have to be stronger, you have to be more competent, more capable. And I think the better CMOs, you know, my prediction for the future is that the better CMOs are going to look for best-in-class training outside of higher ed to bone up on their skills. By the way, you guys, you know, you're surrounded at these institutions with classes, right? So I came to Darden, and I want to be a great teacher, not a good teacher, and we have the best, 5 years in a row, the best teaching faculty in the world, as rated by The Economist. So what have I done? I've gone and sat in on all of these rock star professors' classes. I go and learn from them, right? So CMOs, you have some, you know, at IU, you have some of the world's best faculty in certain areas. If there's something you want to learn, you have the ability to go and sit in on their class and learn it. Or you have the ability to go to conferences. So I think CMOs, those who are really kind of growing their responsibility area, will take it upon themselves to also grow their competency by continuing to read, but looking beyond the border of higher ed to try to go find knowledge outside of higher ed, as well as tapping into resources that they have at their disposal, like their university professors. So those are kind of 3 areas that I would see changing or shifting or moving more in the future.
Great. And it's hard to talk about trends and looking ahead without spending a little bit of time on digital, because digital has become the consumer lens and is certainly much more than a new tactic or an emerging platform. And as marketers in higher education continue to work to become more sophisticated in this area, more data driven, more digitally savvy, I'm sure to emphasize previous points, once again, looking outside of higher ed and the lessons from beyond higher ed in terms of what others are doing in the digital space, because digital marketing is marketing now. Again, looking at it from the consumer's point of view and how they interact with the brand and interact with the organization.
Yeah, so there's a couple things. One of the things I love about the community of higher ed CMOs is, unlike any other CMO community, competitors are kind to one another. You know, you guys are very unique in that you have conferences where you all go and share what you're doing. That is not typical. When I was at Procter & Gamble, I would not have talked to somebody from Unilever, okay? So one of the things you can do is, if you're a smaller school, go find the best in class within your industry and go spend a day with them. So for example, when I was at PetSmart trying to launch a CRM program, I asked the question, who's best in class? This was back in like 2002. Who is best in class in the US and the world at CRM programs? Harrah's at the time, not in my industry, Harrah's was doing some of the best work. I went and spent a couple of days with the Harrah's CRM team to figure out what they were doing and how that might affect me. Boots and Tesco in the UK were among the best in the world, much more advanced in the US. So I hired a former Boots employee to come and spend a week and consult with us on our CRM program. I read books. I went to CRM conferences. I knew nothing about CRM when I landed at PetSmart, and then I had to go launch it. So how could I get up to speed? So one of the things is, on digital, go learn from who you think is the best in higher ed. If you think it's UNC, go talk to Michael. Say, Michael, could I spend a day with you? I just want to talk with your digital team. I want to understand your org structure. How did you set up your org structure? How do they work? Can you walk me through your programs, your planning process? Who are some of your vendors? So learn from within the industry, best in class. Probably don't want to be a direct competitor because they're probably not going to help you. But if they don't perceive you to be a competitive threat, I'm sure they'll help you because it's a nice community. Then go look outside of higher ed. Who do you think is best in class? Gartner and Forbes. Bruce Rogers, who's the Chief Insights Officer of Forbes, recently wrote an article on the top vendors in different areas. Go do a Google search on who are the best vendors in the digital space. Gartner, now this is subscription-based, Gartner is really good about understanding all of this. All right. Serious Decisions is really good in the B2B space, and they might be able to provide you with some free information. So how do you go find vendors who are really good, best-in-class companies and focus in on learning about that. Only do this, though, if digital is a priority for you for the next year. You don't have the ability to learn about everything in a year, right? So you're going to have to prioritize, where do you want to bone up your skills? Sometimes what I used to do is, one of the best ways to learn about things is to go hire a best-in-class vendor. So I did this back in the early 2000s when paid search was just beginning to emerge. I hired the best vendor in the world, and they helped educate me on paid search, and then at some point I brought it in-house, right? So another mechanism to learn about this is to go hire a best-in-class vendor. But again, when you're trying to hire a best-in-class vendor, don't just stay with the vendors who are within higher ed, because that might not be the best-in-class vendor, right? So those are, I think, all ways to try to get up to speed on digital. The other thing is, if digital is a priority, you have to have a smart plan, because you cannot do everything. And the biggest mistake people make is they attempt to do too much and they don't do anything well. And so this is where strategic planning is critical, really prioritizing efforts, focusing in on them, and then coming up with really smart, complete tactics that can help you deliver. So if digital is a priority, you can come up with ways to learn about it over the next year, with a plan on getting up to speed as quickly as possible. Conferences, vendors, best-in-class companies within your industry, best-in-class companies outside of your industry. Turn to the experts who review vendors like Gartner, Forbes, etc. These are all mechanisms that you can use to try to, to get smarter about it. Books, conferences, etc.
Kim, this has been a terrific discussion, and I want to make sure as we close up that we didn't miss anything. So when you think of the biggest opportunities for marketers in 2016, is there anything else, any opportunity areas that we haven't touched on, or any final points that you'd like to share?
One of the most kind of impactful classes I had at Procter & Gamble when I first started there was this notion of managing your manager. Up until that point in my life, I thought I was to be managed. But then Procter said, no, you actually can manage your manager. And little things like, when your manager does something that you really appreciate, reward them. Send them a note. Say, hey, thank you for supporting me in that meeting. Let them, this is, psychologists know this, right? This is conditioning, right? So you want to operantly condition people by rewarding the positive. You can't criticize your boss, but you can positively recognize when they do something right, so that you hope that they continue to do that. You also, through your strategic planning process, can help shift university strategy. You can help shift your role and responsibility. My point being is that you have a lot of power when you're the CMO to actually affect change. You can't do it overnight. You have to do it in a slow, kind of purposive way, but you can do it. And so I think the opportunity for CMOs is to, in their taking small baby steps, knowing the impact that CMOs can and should have, is to try to lead the change that they know to be right, and not necessarily wait for the change to come to them. And this isn't unique to higher ed CMOs. I say this everywhere, because it's a constant issue that CMOs have. They believe that they have the ability to have greater impact on the company, but they're not given that right. Well, you can change that right through kind of small, purposeful steps to try to grow your responsibility. But part of this means doing a great job with the territory you've been given, demonstrating the value that you're providing to the university, that then gives you the right to kind of expand your territory. So I think the big opportunity, so for example, I'm looking at marketers on the board of directors, just to show you how important marketing is to firms. As a simple example, we looked at 65,000 board biographies. We looked at about 1,500 different S&P firms. And we looked at their performance over time. Boards that had marketers on them significantly outperformed in revenue growth, top line growth, significantly outperform their peers that did not have marketers on the boards, but after the financial collapse versus before the financial collapse. Okay, so boards with marketers tend to outperform boards without marketers in terms of growth. Marketers matter to companies. And so, but in general, across the board, they tend to be under leveraged. There are many companies where they're not under leveraged, they're fully utilized, but in many cases, they're not fully utilized. And it's the job of CMOs to try to shift the university, to try to make that change. And the power is in the data, and the power is in their results and demonstrating their results. And so the opportunity, I think, for marketers, if they sit back and go, shoot, I think I could have more impact, then the question is, what can you do differently? How can you try to convince your internal constituents that you can drive that impact, and your power is in quantitative data, not kind of anecdotal examples, but in quantitative data. And so I really believe I'm very bullish about the future of marketing, because I know the power of marketing to affect change and impact firm performance. But a lot of this is going to have to come from marketers themselves, ourselves, because it's not going to be handed to us. And so that, I think, is the biggest opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, thank you. That's a great closing point. And wow, you packed a ton of excellent content in over the last hour. So Kim, thank you. Thank you so much for your time and all of the insights that you shared with us.
Great. Thanks so much.
And always, of course, always great to talk to an IU alumna as well. Well, thanks as always to our sponsors of Marketing Live, M. Stoner and FormStack, who are definitely among those aforementioned experts. And thank you again to Kimberly Whitler. Be sure to get reminders about this and other shows by subscribing to the Higher Ed Live newsletter. You can browse the archives on higheredlive.com or subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. I'm Rob Zinkin. I wish you and your families happy holidays and all the best in the new year. And I look forward to seeing you back here in January for more higher ed marketing and branding conversations. Thanks again for tuning in to Marketing Live on the Higher Ed Live Network.